I want to bring in Callum Borchers. He's a reporter at the Washington Post. He joins us now. Boy, Callum, a lot to get off the president's chest last night. I want to start first with his defense, in particular of his remarks in Charlotte. He tweeted today, last night in Phoenix, I read the things from my statements on Charlottesville that the fake news media didn't cover fairly. Do you think the president can kind of rewrite history now by re-representing those remarks? And is that what he's trying to do here?
I think it'll only work for folks who have very short memories. I mean, he read sort of a truncated transcript of his remarks, as you could say. And, you know, the way that he is trying to present that totally left out the whole part of his initial remarks on Charlottesville that caused the controversy in the first place. Had he actually stopped where he stopped last night in Phoenix, he might have steered clear from trouble. I mean, sure, some folks might have still said, well, we'd like you to call out white supremacists specifically. But I think that if he had just talked about racism and bigotry and violence and left it there, people sort of would have assumed he was talking about the white supremacist side. Instead, he went on and talked about many sides, and that's where he ran into trouble.
So to date, just to separate fact from fiction here, Callum, has the president taken responsibility for his comments?
He hasn't. You know, he's been very defensive about them from the get-go. I mean, you sort of saw him make those first remarks about many sides on Saturday. On Monday, he seemed to kind of clean up the mess a little bit, and he did denounce white supremacists specifically on that day, but he did not say that there was anything wrong with his initial statement. And then, of course, the next day at that memorable news conference at Trump Tower in New York, he doubled down on his original statement, saying that both sides were to blame for the violence. So his position here is that he is right all along, and it is the media that has been misrepresenting him and has been unfair to him.
Is there a sense, Callum, has the president lost any of his base, any momentum with these attacks and after these Charlottesville comments?
Well, he has lost a little bit of his base. It's hard to know exactly what the cause of that is, but my colleague Aaron Blake broke this down for us yesterday. There was a tweet just a couple days ago by Trump's own pollster showing a small erosion in Trump's base. The approval, I think, had dropped by 6 percentage points in the span of about a month. It's not the end of the world, but it is a sign that things are not quite as strong with Trump's base as they used to be. And also keep in mind that we're coming off of a day in which Breitbart News, led once again by Trump's former chief strategist, Stephen Bannon, hammered him for that Afghanistan speech. They absolutely hated the idea of sending more troops abroad. Of course, Trump ran as a non-interventionist. And so what we see is that although Breitbart and other pro-Trump media outlets like it will defend almost anything he does, they do want to hold him to account for certain campaign promises.
The president also renewed attacks on Republicans last night, particularly Senator Jeff Flake. The president wants to do away with the filibuster. That's where you move from 60 votes to 51. Do you think that'll be a problem for Republicans? They've been playing by the rules, or do you think that changing them all of a sudden will make a difference in getting legislation passed?
Well, I think the problem for them is down the longer term, right? And I think that that's probably where you see the reluctance from Mitch McConnell. And this is reportedly one of the great divisions between Trump and McConnell that the New York Times highlighted in their story yesterday. You know, I'm certain that McConnell is looking ahead and saying, you know, this might sound good in the short term, but if we blow up the filibuster, what precedent are we setting for whenever Democrats, presumably someday, return to power? You know, then they will be allowed to do the same thing. And do we really want to go that down that road?
Yeah, you were talking about the New York Times comments, and the New York Times was saying that, reporting that McConnell doubts that the president can save his presidency. What do you think that tells us, that if Mitch McConnell has come forward saying that, where does that leave the Republican Party and the president's agenda?
Well, in the short term, it leaves them in a tough spot for 2018. But in the longer run, it leaves them in a spot where they have to think seriously about whether they are going to field the primary challenger for the president in 2020. I know it sounds early, but, you know, these races start pretty early as well. And I think that you've had the Democrats, and maybe it's just a little bit of mind games here, but, you know, there was a report yesterday that the Democrats are already conducting opposition research on potential primary challengers for Trump in 2020. As I said, that may just be kind of mind games trying to get in the president's head and make them think that that is a possibility. But I think that that is sort of the big picture here.
The president also threatened that he's going to launch a government shutdown if he doesn't get funding for that border wall. Do you think he'll actually do that? I
think it'd be a tough sell, partly because keep in mind that the entire campaign was all about Mexico paying for the wall. And now more recently, he has kind of massaged that message and said, well, Congress is going to front the money and then we're going to make Mexico pay us back, even if it's not through a direct check. You know, maybe it is some kind of border tax, and we will use that money to offset the cost of the border wall and kind of make Mexico pay in a roundabout way. That will satisfy some supporters, but it becomes a lot more difficult to sell the idea that you're going to shut down the government to pay for something that Mexico is supposed to be paying for.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how voters feel about that. Last night also, Callum, the president didn't announce the pardon of convicted Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Many people were wondering if he would do it, but he did hint, saying that I think he's going to be just fine. If the president, Callum, decides to pardon him, what kind of controversy will he be looking at?
It's a good question. I think it is a move that would be very popular with a certain segment of his base, and I think that that is really where he's focused. You know, I think that the president, the evidence from the last several weeks suggests that he sort of expects and in some cases relishes in the criticism that he gets from certain quarters, obviously from Democrats and you know, largely from the media in a lot of cases. And so I would imagine that that would be a move that you know, will be heavily criticized for sure, but he may not mind that. You know, he may want to invite that criticism. It gives him more of an opportunity to appeal to his base and say, well, look at the way I'm being treated unfairly and attacked by the other side. And oh, by the way, this is a move that you guys really are going to like.
Yeah, and that's tends to be something that his base does love when he does that. Shows that he can be somewhat of a maverick. I want to ask you about Steve Bannon, though. He's out, obviously, as chief strategist. And you wrote in today's post that the president was channeling Bannon in Phoenix. What led you to that assessment?
Well, the message that the president delivered specifically about the media had Bannon's voice running through it. And I'm not talking about sort of a standard denunciation of, you know, quote, fake news. The president went a little bit farther, a little bit sharper last night when he talked about how he thinks that journalists don't really like this country and they actually don't want to make America great again. That's essentially a paraphrase of something that Steve Bannon said at the Conservative Political Action Conference in February in one of his rare public appearances. And it was the same message about how the economy is going to get better, the job situation is going to get better, and journalists aren't going to like that. They're going to fight you and they're not going to give you your country back, is what Bannon said in February. And it strikes me that this is part of Bannon's effort to influence the president from the outside. I mean, you can go all the way back to the immediate aftermath of Election Day when he was telling the Wall Street Journal how he expected Breitbart to cover the Trump White House in his absence. And what he said was, I expect them to hold us accountable. And if we don't stick to what we promised on the campaign trail, I imagine that Breitbart will hammer us. And then at CPAC, he specifically asked the audience to hold the Trump White House accountable. So I think that Bannon is someone who sensed early on that there were other more moderate advisors in the Trump White House who were going to try to pull the president to the center. He says that that's exactly what has happened. That's one of the reasons he's on the outside now. And he's trying to use that kind of stick and carrot combination to bring the president back in line.
Callum Borchers from the Washington Post newsroom. Callum, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you.